Segmentation, critical to security success. Now, I'm a big believer that defenders need to elevate their defensive capability through understanding. Now, we're going to leverage MITRE ATT&CK framework to do this, but this scenario here is an example of education. Everything that these threat actors, one or more, when targeting the vertical of education, has a variety of tactics and techniques that they're going to use. Everything in red has been called out here. And as we zoom in and look at this a little bit more deeply, we can see the techniques is the how they achieve the tactic. For example, valid accounts are used in a variety of different locations. So it's used for initial access, persistence, privilege escalation, and defense evasion. Now, these are the how they achieve that tactic. And as defenders, we need to put in mitigating controls to make it very difficult for the adversary to have success. And the one place we can do this in this example is risk-based multi-factor authentication. We add a layer of complexity that a username and password alone is not going to allow them to get persistence or initial access. But as defenders, we have to stay on top of the changes the adversary does in order to overcome the challenges introduced. And in this case, they may use something like multi-factor authentication request generation. Some might know it as multi-factor bombing or multi-factor fatigue. The point here is to create enough prompts that the user just gives in and hits accept on their multi-factor device. So we have to stay diligent. Now, when we look at Salt Typhoon, this is a Chinese state-sponsored advanced persistent threat group. Now, they have recently been implicated in attacks against global telecommunication providers. Now, this adversary is very stealthy, persistent, and they have strategic focus on espionage and data exfiltration. Now, this isn't a comprehensive list, but this just gives you an idea of how the adversary has had success. Now, everything in red is a capability. Well, initial access, well, they exploited public-facing applications. Execution, they used things like PowerShell. Persistence, they modified the system process. Lateral movement, which we're going to focus on in this series, because the adversary objective is never to land on an asset and stay there. That's just the start of the game. Once they compromise an asset, they are going to need to move laterally. And this is a tremendous opportunity for defenders. We don't ignore the other things, but we know for a fact that once they land, they will move laterally. So let's dig into the attack path a little bit. Again, this is not comprehensive. It's just to give you an idea of the thought process that goes into building a defensive architecture to minimize the adversary's success. And so there was a couple of CVEs that they took advantage of. One was around Microsoft Exchange servers and the other Advantage. Again, not a comprehensive list, but they compromised these vulnerabilities using an exploit and landed on those systems. Now that gave them initial access. Now once they had initial access, then it's execution. And they leveraged PowerShell. And they used PowerShell to download additional payloads such as Ghost Spider backdoor. They also used Windows Command Shell to execute commands to enumerate system information and deploy tools for lateral movement. So there's, again, an opportunity here for defenders. In order for those tools to come into the environment, they would have had to go through a bunch of different controls. Even though they've landed on a system themselves, you probably have to get that Ghost Spider backdoor through a next generation firewall. So there's tremendous opportunity to defend, but obviously they made their way into the environment and those controls failed. Now persistence, they ended up creating what's called Crowdoor backdoor, which adds a registry entries that executes malicious code automatically. And they also use Sparrow Door, which was a custom backdoor that establishes persistence via DLL search order hijacking. Then they moved on to privilege escalation, and they used Mimikatz to extract credentials from LSAS And they use token manipulation to elevate privileges by impersonating system tokens. Now, here's the lateral movement piece, which is going to be the core focus of the rest of the session. But the adversary used a variety of capabilities, from RDP hijacking to SMB Windows admin shares to pass the hash to lateral tool transfer and exploitation of remote services. Lateral movement is a critical phase of Salt Typhoon's operations. It enables the group to expand control within the network. As I mentioned earlier, if we make this very, very difficult, it allows us to become more resilient. It may not stop the initial vulnerability from being exploited, but it will stop the adversary's ability to move within the organization. Credential access, again, LSAS dumping captures credentials stored in local security authority subsystem. Discovery, they use tools like MBT scan and PowerShell scripts that are used to gather information about the network. And then exfiltration, they use tools like WinRAR. They compressed and encrypted that data before they exfiltrated it out of the environment. And then impact was really focused around data manipulation, leveraging Ghost Spider's backdoor, which provided the persistence for long-term espionage and potential future disruption. Now, this group has been known to manipulate or delete data to disrupt operations and cover their tracks. Now, when we look at this and we pull it all together, again, these don't necessarily happen in sequence, but you get an idea of the opportunity that defenders really have. Now, initial access to execution, to persistence, all of these things have the technique to support the objective. You got privilege escalation, lateral movement, which is the core focus of this session, credential access, discovery, exfiltration, and then impact. Now, we don't need to be 100% correct at 100% of all the opportunities the adversary has here. What we do have is an ability to make it difficult for them to progress their attack by being very disruptive. And if we put them in a box, all they're going to do is make a lot more noise, which gives our teams more time to detect them in the environment, or our tools more time to identify that they exist. Now, here's the opportunity for the defenders. This is the exciting piece. Exploit a public-facing application. Well, how can we minimize our risk here? Well, we can update software, or we can have exploit prevention capabilities. So we can use things like risk-based vulnerability management. We can patch and update the platform more regularly based on the information we're getting from risk-based vulnerability management. And we can have tools like endpoint protection, detection, and response. Now, when it comes to execution, they're using command and scripting interpreter. Now, there's lots of things we can do here. Anti-malware, execution prevention, code signing, privilege account management, and so on. I'm just going to call out endpoint protection, detection, and response specifically here, as well as for persistence, they can create and modify system process. Now, we might need a different capability around behavioral prevention or system process protection. But again, we can use things like endpoint protection, detection, and response here as well. Now, my point of calling out EDR technology here, even with privilege escalation, for exploitation for privilege escalation, leveraging behavioral prevention capabilities, is that you don't need 1,000 different tools to drive an outcome. Now, these are resident typically on an asset, and therefore endpoint protection, detection, and response are critically valuable in that use case. Now, lateral movement, they're actually going to leverage the network. There's two ways that we can look at this. One is we can look at it from a detection perspective, baseline the environment, look at the behaviors of those particular assets, monitor them over time, and if there's deviations from that, then we can alert on it. So that's an easy way to get visibility in the environment when your controls fail. Now, green is a detection capability, but red is a preventative mechanism. Now, red in this case is micro-segmentation, and now we can do things like workload segmentation, campus segmentation, and application segmentation. See, these are all opportunities for defenders. Now, as we start to round this out, we got credential dumping that gives us credential access. Again, we're leveraging maybe endpoint detection response. Discovery, maybe there's not much we can do here as an example. And that may not be true, but I'm just giving you perspective. You may not have all the tools you need to prevent 100% of everything. And in fact, you're probably never going to get that. So detection is key. And here, again, maybe network behavioral analytics, analyzing the network traffic over time, it will be a great indicator of something that has changed. Now, exfiltration is over a C2 channel. And again, now we can do things like encrypted visibility or TLS or quick proxy, and next generation firewalls or web proxy can provide that outcome. And again, we can use network behavioral analytics here because we can see that obviously an asset now is talking to an external resource that normally it hasn't, and it could be identified as something interesting. Or we might see a data hoarding event or data exfiltration event. Now, data manipulation, you might leverage things like data backup or micro-segmentation. You can do automated snapshot recovery, and again, workload, campus, and application segmentation. The opportunity for the defender to disrupt anywhere along the path is key here. Now, as we move into micro-segmentation for the campus, the goal really is to establish a level of trust by understanding the profile of the asset and the user that's connecting to the environment, as well as posturing to have a good sense of the level of trust that we want to grant that particular asset. And then we're going to enforce that trust using access control. We're only going to give them access to the resources they need and drive towards microsegmentation. And we'll continuously verify trust. We'll look at threats and vulnerabilities that may exist. And based on that new information, we may in fact respond to the level of trust that we've granted that particular asset. When I say asset, I'm talking user and machine together when they both exist, or just a machine if no user is associated to it. Point here is that I may, during the time that they're connected, change my mind based on new information. And if I do, I may revoke access to the environment. I may move them into a quarantined VLAN. I may restrict their ability to access critical services. Now, in order to do that, we need to profile. And there's lots of mechanisms built in Identity Services Engine in order for us to drive that. So we need to know, is it a phone? What model? What version? Is it an IoT-based device? Is it a corporate device? We need to understand this so we can build policy associated with those profiles as a condition. Cisco's also advanced this with Catalyst Center and our ability to do AI endpoint analytics. This is to help identify all the different IoT-based devices that exist, from the coffee machine to the thermostat to the smart fridge. Whatever gets plugged into your environment, we now augment it with AI endpoint analytics to determine what that asset is, so you can build policies based on these profiles to either allow or restrict access in your environment. Now, in order for us to grant access, we may also want to posture the device and look at, are you running the right version of malware protection? Is the firewall enabled? What's the application history look like? Do you have disk encryption enabled? Let's look in the registry for certain things. So there's an opportunity for us to further scrutinize those assets. And we can do it based on thick client that you install with advanced capabilities, all the way down to agentless, where there's no agent whatsoever, and we're leveraging things like PowerShell or scripting in order to provide the data we need in order to make a decision. So from the client all the way down to agentless, and with each of these you have pros and cons: additional visibility, better security or more protection or more insight to make better decisions. But you have access to all use cases based on the scenario in which you're driving towards. Now let's look at this. We've authenticated, we've profiled, we've postured the device, and they have access to the environment. But we want to kick off a vulnerability scan using Qualys, Rapid7, or Tenable, and use that information to determine if that access should be granted or not. And we do have a condition in our authorization policy that says if a CVSS score is greater than 5, then we want to quarantine and restrict access. Likewise, using Cisco Secure Endpoint, If malware was introduced anytime during the connection, that information then is shared to Identity Services Engine, and then we can take a action against that particular asset and do a change of authorization and move it into a quarantine VLAN, removing the risk from the environment. Now we can do that at the host level as well, but this is using a network-centric approach here in this scenario. Now, as we continue to advance, we start looking at software-defined access and TrustSec, and really start building policies based on business intent. And in this case, we don't worry about IPs unless we're using it as an attribute to define location. Once we determine what the asset is, we tag it, and now we have this simplified policy to remove access for, in this case, employees to employees communicating. We remove things like deny destination equal to 3389, which is RDP. And this stops the lateral movement within the campus environment. And these tags can be shared anywhere in the infrastructure to build additional policies with additional context. And that's where we get this common policy leveraging secure group tags. And this could be shared to workload segmentation capabilities that we have that we're going to talk about next. Now, micro-segmentation for workloads. So we've got network security, workload security, cloud security, and cloud native security. And these all have different people managing each one of those areas. And they may have different processes in order to drive towards those outcomes. And there's lots of different technologies leveraged. This is complexity at its best. Imagine trying to determine where the control is. Where best to put it? Where did the packet get dropped? All of this is adding tremendous burden on these teams. And this is where secure workload comes in. Secure workload has the ability to get the visibility required in order to build the policy required to minimize our risk. From risk reduction all the way down to full zero trust segmentation, secure workload helps you. Not only does it discover the policy based on the telemetry you feed it, but it can also analyze that policy before enforcing it to ensure that when you do enforce it, you're not going to cause disruption. And we can augment this with other things in the environment, like labels from AWS or Azure or VMware. And we deliver this at the host, the cloud, or the network. Now, when you start looking at the architecture, it becomes that much more compelling because security isn't a point product. Security is a solution. And here what we have is we've got Catalyst Center, we've got Identity Services Engine, we may have Cyber Vision in the operational environment, we might have Cisco Secure Client for network visibility, and you've got all these workloads. And so why not share that telemetry across these platforms to make better decisions? So Identity Services Engine can take those tags that we've identified and created with ICE and share that to build user-based policies at the workload level using secure workload. We do that policy discovery and analysis and make sure that we're not impacting the environment when we're delivering the controls. We also have integrations with things like AlgoSec, Tufin, and Skybox. Now, the three core use cases are micro-segmentation, behavioral detection and protection, and then vulnerability detection and protection. We're focused on micro-segmentation, but behavioral and vulnerability insight in secure workload are critically important to making decisions on what should be allowed or not allowed over time. Now, how do we get to understand how to build policy? Now, workload security is tough. Cisco has the ability to consume flow data into secure workload, whether it comes directly from the agent or from network devices. We consume that data and then we crunch it and we determine what are the relationships between all of these different applications. And we call this application dependency mapping. As we do that, we have the ability then to build the rule set or policy that is required to allow those services to function. And then we can do policy analysis and look for any deviations and correct those deviations before we roll this out to production. It's a pretty powerful technology, and it truly gives defenders the ability to remove risk within the data center environment, regardless of where that data center is. It could be in the cloud, it could be on-premise, physical virtual container, it could be a security group, it could be a firewall. We're now able to deliver that control from one central policy enforcement mechanism. Now, as we're starting to build these out, we may not start with micro-segmentation out of the gate. What we might start doing is risk reduction first. We'll reduce the attack surface by doing things like production and non-production should never communicate with each other. We might also start to ring fence and start saying that, RDP access should only be coming from jump hosts, as an example. And then we get all the way down to the application and start driving towards full microsegmentation and building out policies discovered with application dependency mapping, and ultimately result in a deny all at the very bottom. And this is a zero trust outcome. And we're finally driving towards a human intent-based policy that we can understand that provides the guardrails, the ring fencing, and ultimately microsegmentation within the workload environment. Now, as we evolve, we start looking at Cisco Hypershield. This is where Cisco truly starts changing the game. Now, we know segmentation is tough and challenging, especially with applications and workload growth in the environment. They're dynamic. They change all the time. Patching is hard. The number of vulnerabilities that we need addressing seems to increase exponentially every week. And mitigation takes too long. And ultimately, the disruption that may be caused when we're patching systems, we're doing upgrades to policy, we're doing firmware updates. All of these add risk to the environment. And Hypershield starts to address each one of these. Now, it's centered around Cisco Security Cloud Control. There's telemetry that feeds into the platform and drives two outcomes today: autonomous segmentation and distributed exploit protection. Now, the platform's AI native. It's kernel level enforcement today with self-qualifying updates. And this is both public and private cloud, and it drives outcomes on virtual machines, Kubernetes, and bare metal machines. So how do we do that? We use Tesseract Security Agent, which is based on open source technology called Extended Berkeley Packet Filtering that is built directly into the Linux kernel. Now, this is how Hypershield is able to provide deep visibility and enforcement actions at the workload level, including network open, file open, read, write, and privilege escalation. Now, Extended Berkeley Packet Filtering provides a safe enclave within the kernel to ensure applications continue to keep running as Hypershield recommends, tests, and deploys policy updates. Now, Tesseract is not just another agent that is difficult to deploy and consume processing power. It's essentially a lightweight loader for eBPF, or Extended Berkeley Packet Filtering programs. Now, Hypershield uses this deep workload visibility and enforcement to create an application fingerprint to gain intimate understanding of the application behavior. Now, as the app changes, Hypershield is able to dynamically modify and shift its policies as well. Now, self-qualifying firmware and policy updates. Again, the goal here is to understand how the applications operate, and as changes are made, we want to test those changes without disrupting the environment. So how do we do that? Well, Cisco creates a shadow data path of the production data path, and it tests those policy changes or firmware upgrades against the shadow data path. Once it's successful and we're confident with the outcomes, then we'll shift the shadow data path into the production data path, and we'll make the previous production data path into the shadow data path moving forward. And this allows us to do hitless deployment with a single click, and it truly allows teams to move at the speed of the threat. Now, the use cases are autonomous segmentation and distributed exploit protection. So autonomous segmentation is understanding the applications, building the policy, and changing as the applications change. Distributed exploit protection is mitigate against known and unknown vulnerabilities and using surgical mitigating controls that are prescriptive to the vulnerabilities that may exist. And this allows us to protect within minutes while keeping the application up and running. Now, autonomous segmentation, we need a complete understanding of the applications, the file changes, the workload behavior, the network flow, and we need to understand that in order to build policy. As we build those policy, just like in secure workload, we want to make sure that those policies are not going to be disruptive, and we're going to apply those policies to the shadow data path to ensure that the outcomes are being delivered. And the policies are updated to be stricter as needed when suspicion occurs. Now, with distributed exploit protection, we might see a CVE come in. We'll have risk-based understanding of the CVSS score and whether or not we should address that particular vulnerability. If we've determined that that is the case based on the true risk, then we'll implement those surgical mitigating controls in the path of the process, but allow the application to continue to operate without disruption. And ultimately improving our overall effectiveness score without disrupting the environment. Because as I mentioned earlier, this is tested against the shadow data path until we're confident enough to transition into the production data path. Now, this is all managed using a unified management platform called Cisco Security Cloud Control. It leverages natural language interface to allow you to ask it questions in human language and get a response back in human form. And it allows you to intelligently place those shields, right, the protection mechanisms in your environment without causing disruption. Now, this includes both public and private cloud, and it includes both the end system enforcer using Tesseract Security Agent. Today is for Linux and Kubernetes nodes. Windows is coming, and then network-based enforcer, which is a virtual machine appliance. And we will be offering network switch port or server DPU NICs in the very near future. Now, the security cloud control is innovative in itself. It's allowing us to drive security controls using a single unified platform, again, powered with AI. So it can help us determine where best to put a control in a convoluted, complicated environment. Now, today we've got physical and virtual firewall support, Hypershield, multi-cloud defense. We are adding secure access, identity services engine, again, micro-segmentation in the campus, vulnerability management, focused on risk, secure workload, XDR and Talos, as well as Splunk. Again, truly differentiating. And the goal here is to get a true understanding of where my risks might exist in the environment, create objects once, so get some operational effectiveness and efficiency. If I create an object, why not apply that anywhere in the ecosystem if it could be leveraged elsewhere? And then insight, like where's the elephant flow spike observed? What about risky users accessing privileged applications? Well, we see that with FTD and secure access. Ultimately, the goal here is to increase efficiency and get a true understanding of where best to put those controls while optimizing throughout the life cycle. Now, Cisco really does have what we call best of solution. As we start pulling things together like identity and access, driving towards micro-segmentation and zero trust, leveraging identity services engine, to workload protection, leveraging secure workload and Hypershield, driving towards, again, micro-segmentation and zero trust in the workload environment. Now we start to share additional insight between the campus and the data center. And now we've got additional context, and we use those security group tags that we've created earlier on in the campus infrastructure to build identity-based policy on those workloads themselves. So for example, an HR user connects, they've postured, they profiled, they have access to specific systems and only those systems themselves. They can't move laterally in the campus environment. They're tagged with 2. As they get into the HR systems or the workloads themselves, we're going to use that identifier 2 in our policy for those HR users. And now we've got a user-based access control list for the things that the user needs access to, as well as having access to all the back-end services that are required to make the application function. We have risk-based vulnerability management, scrutinizing both the campus infrastructure as well as the data center environment, making sure that we're prioritizing our patch management program, security cloud to manage, artificial intelligence to augment. You've got XDR, SIM, and observability to do the deep data analytics required to truly understand threats and how they may navigate within your environment when there is success. Powered by Cisco Talos, and ultimately providing incident response services as well. Now, Cisco truly does meet you where you are in your security journey. This does not mean that all the other investments that you've made outside of Cisco go away. We augment those capabilities, add additional value, and provide you an integrated platform approach to security.